Hello, I'm Joe Neville and welcome to Linux for Networkers. Hints, tips and how-tos to get you using and learning Linux even if you have zero experience with it. In this second video we'll be looking at installing Linux. So what are your options? If you have the luxury of dedicated server equipment, you can do a bare metal install. That's where you load Linux directly onto a server. But for most people, that's not going to be convenient. The only compute that they've got at their disposal is a laptop, maybe their work laptop, so they need a different option. Step forward, a hypervisor. Examples of these are VMware Workstation, VirtualBox, or if you're using an Apple Mac, VMware Fusion. So this is a piece of software which is loaded onto your laptop and can allow guest operating systems to share the resources. So in this diagram we see you've got your laptop or server which is running the host OS in this case, and in general I think the most popular would be Windows. We load the hypervisor onto it, so VMware Workstation or VirtualBox, and then we load Linux onto that, which is really great because it allows us a quick and easy way of start playing with Linux without having to delete any operating systems, without having to actually really dedicate any resources to it. So in this video I'm going to be taking the hypervisor approach. So step one, get Linux. Now, first question we need to ask ourselves is which distribution or distro of Linux are we going to use? So there's many different distributions out there. They're kind of like families of Linux which have the Linux kernel, associated libraries and a package management system. So on a very simplistic level, the two main families are Debian based Linux distros or Fedora stroke Red Hat based distributions. So in this example I'm going to be looking at one of the distributions that is in the Debian family, and that is Ubuntu, which is a very easy to use version of Linux. It's the one that I've got the most experience. So what we need to do first of all is to get ourselves a copy of Ubuntu Server. The way that we do this is by opening up our browser, going to ubuntu.com, download server, and there you see you've got the download options. This is completely free, open source software which we can use to experiment and play with. On the screen you'll see that we have a number of options. You've got different options here of this is the long-term support option, which is the most stable, 14.04.3, which I would suggest that you use. There is a more experimental version. Ubuntu Server, well, Ubuntu in general releases a new version every 6 months. They release these long-term support ones which have, it says here, support guaranteed until April 2019, and the more experimental versions which have new features in them, those are only supported for 9 months. So because we want to use a stable version, let's stick with the LTS version and download 14.0.3. So we just hit download. That will connect and start to download the image. There we are. Thanks for downloading Ubuntu Server. It's 574 meg. Now, one of the things I should mention here is that Ubuntu do offer a desktop version which is much more like your Windows client. But one of my first suggestions for anybody that wants to really learn Linux is that they don't use the desktop. So don't download the desktop version. That's too easy for you if you're someone that's used to Windows. If you really want to get to learn Linux, you need to be using the shell. You need to be looking at the server only. So that's like if you're a networker and you're used to using Telnet or PuTTY to log into devices, you're going to be using the command line of Linux rather than using some kind of fancy GUI. So once Ubuntu Server has finished downloading, we open up our hypervisor, in this case VMware Workstation. We go to File, New Virtual Machine. We're going to do a custom install. Next, and here we need to point our hypervisor at the downloaded file. So I'll just browse to where I have there's my Ubuntu 14.4.3. copy that, hit next. Virtual machine name, I'm going to use it -4. This is where you can allocate processors to your virtual machine. For this instance, we're just going to leave it as the default. Here you can allocate the memory for your virtual machine. We'll leave that as default as well. Hit next, and this is the networking options, which I will be looking at in a later video, but for the moment we're going to just leave it at the default and hit next. Next again, and the virtual disk type, so we're going pretty much with all the defaults. Maximum disk size, it's got 20 gig. We don't really need that, we'll just go for 8. Next. Okay, so and then we have the option to customize the hardware if we wish. So you can go in and add different settings. We don't really need to for this install, so I can close that. Power on the virtual machine after creation, yes please. So hit finish. And this is Ubuntu Server install. I'm going to install Ubuntu. UK. Just make sure it gives us the right keyboard. This is the networking configuring. So we've got configuring network with DHCP. I've got DHCP on my home network. This is just a wireless, a standard home wireless network that we're on. So DHCP is running. I'll give it a new host name. Continue. Full name for the new user. Now, as I mentioned, these videos are going to be quick and dirty, not secure. This is just to get you up and running as quickly as possible. So I'm just going to use very simple username for my account. So I put in Joe, continue, new password. Now mine's a weak password, which it wouldn't normally, cause I'm not adhering to the basic password requirements. Not worried about that because this is just an experimental box to play around with for myself. So I'm going to use a weak password, that's fine. Next setup. Do I want to encrypt my home directory? No. This is getting the time from the time server via NTP, I guess. Okay, it's detected London, correct. So this is the partition of the disk. So most of this we can just go through with the defaults. So it's selected, guided, use entire disk and set up LVM. So the entire disk is the disk that the hypervisor has allocated. This isn't the disk of the entire disk of your host. So you're not going to wipe anything on your laptop by selecting this. There's the partition, that's fine for us. And this is where you actually have to change from the defaults though, because the partition of the disk, if you were doing this bare metal, this would be wiping what's already on the disk if there was anything on there. So it gives you the default of no. But we do actually want to write these changes to disk, so we select yes. Otherwise we just go into a loop and we can't go any further. We're going to allocate the amount for the volume group here, use for guided, so that's the full amount, that's fine, continue. And these are the partitions of the disk. Again, if you were doing this as a proper install of Ubuntu Server, you would have to check that this was correct for your setup. In this case, because we're just on a hypervisor, we change it to yes and go forwards. And now we're doing the install. Now it's asking for details about configuring the package manager. So in a later video, I'll be talking about package management. That's basically how you get software onto your Linux server. If you're in a lab, if you're sat behind a proxy, this is where you would put the address of the proxy. I'm not, as I mentioned earlier, I'm sat in a home lab just using my wireless connection, so I don't need a proxy. I leave that blank. So we're continuing with the install of the software. I've just skipped ahead a bit. Okay, how do you want to manage upgrades? No automatic updates, please. Okay, so this is actually something where we want to tune or install. I find this makes it a bit easier. We're going to select Open SSH server and continue, because we'll be logging into the server via SSH. Okay, now we're installing the Grub bootloader. It asks us install the Grub bootloader to master boot record. Yes, we can just select the defaults here. Okay, and the installation is finished, so hit return to continue. Now the system's booting. This is Ubuntu booting. And there's our login. So my username is Joe and my password. And there we have it, a brand new install of Ubuntu Server for us to play around with and learn Linux. In part 3, I'll be looking at some of the first steps that you'll want to take with your new server.